from David. It's fantastic to have you here in London. And thanks to all of you guys for coming. And I think that the strength of the presence is really indicative of how much interest there is in David as an artist, and of course in Yellowface and his work generally. So that's fantastic. So just to give you an idea of what we're going to do today, I'm going to talk to David for about 35, 40 minutes, something like that. We've been given a time limit, so I'll have to negotiate that. And then we'll give you all an opportunity to individually ask questions from the floor, so we'll have about half an hour to do that. So we'd like to cover various kinds of topics, particularly, obviously, Asian American, your kind of status as an Asian American writer, questions of race and identity in theatre. Yellowface, not just simply as a play, but I think the context, the kind of political context of Yellowface, which is one of the reasons why I think it's really pertinent right this very minute in the UK. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But just to start, I know that we have a really strong and emerging crop of British East Asian writers right now. They're really starting to break through. And so I think it would be useful to start with some of your background, because I think that might be really interesting for them. So if I could ask you just to tell us a little bit about how you became interested in writing and writing for theatre specifically.
Great, thanks, Amanda. And Amanda and I know each other from were you doing a research trip to the States?
Anyway. Yeah, I've been here a couple of times. Research trips.
We met in New York, so I'm really happy that you're doing this. Just checking sightlines here.
Shall we move back?
Yeah, you move. You're saying you guys.
Great, and yeah, thanks for coming out. Okay, so I was born in Los Angeles, and my parents are both immigrants. My father was originally from Shanghai, and my mother was Fujianese Chinese from the Philippines. And they met at the University of Southern California, and stayed in the States and had us, basically. And I didn't grow up really going to theater or with much of a theatrical background, but my freshman year as an undergraduate at university, I attended Stanford, which some of you also attended. Yay. And we would go up to the city to, we just sort of bus kids from the dorm up to the city to see shows. So I saw some plays at the American Conservatory Theater in San Francisco. I think I saw The Winter's Tale and Thornton Wilder's The Matchmaker. And I thought, oh, maybe I can do that. So I started trying to write plays in my spare time. And I found a professor at Stanford. Stanford didn't have playwriting classes at the time, but there was, they had a creative writing department who was a novelist who taught a drama class. So he was willing to take a look at some of my plays, and he told me they were really bad, which they were. And then my problem was that I wanted to write plays, but I didn't actually know anything about the theater. And so, but the same professor is a good guy, and he then set up basically a course of study for me, and we created a playwriting major at a school that didn't have one. And still actually to this day I don't think has one. And so I just basically saw as many plays and read as many plays as I could, and that became my education over the next few years. The summer before my senior year in college, I took a playwriting course with Sam Shepard, the wonderful Pulitzer Prize-winning American playwright, Maria Irene Fornés, and I learned to write more from my subconscious, unconscious, and at that point I realized that I was interested in some of these sort of cross-cultural East-West issues that have ended up being most of my body of work. And so I wrote a play to be done in my dorm my senior year of college called FOB, which through a variety of fortuitous circumstances got produced off-Broadway at the Public Theater about 14 months later, produced by Joseph Howe. And so I started having a career.
Yeah. Well, actually, I was going to ask you a little bit about that relationship with the public, because, I mean, for those of you who don't know, it's a big prestigious theatre in New York. It's particularly associated with new and emerging writers. But you kind of, how did you get produced there? How did you get that?
Well, actually, this is interesting in terms of British East Asian actors, because really, how does one go from a dormitory to the Public Theater in 14 months?
Yeah, exactly.
It's sort of a strange story, but interesting because it was largely the result of political activism. A year before my play was produced at the Public had done a show by a writer named Len Jenkins called New Jerusalem, in which a Caucasian actor was cast in an Asian role. And this led to protests at that point, which predated the Miss Saigon protests, which we may end up talking about, by about a decade. The Asian actors in that period picketed the Public Theater. And Joe Papp, the sort of legendary Joe Papp, who created Shakespeare in the Park and the Public Theater and produced Chorus Line on Broadway, and just sort of maybe the most important American theatrical producer of the last half of the 20th century. Joe, being who he was, Joe sort of invited the protesters in and had a meeting with them and hired one of them onto his staff with a mandate to find plays for Asian actors. And it was just about that time that my play came across their desk. So I always consider myself the beneficiary of affirmative action because, there was a slot created and I was the person who got to take advantage of that slot. Yeah. And notably, it was as a result of political social pressure from the community of actors at the time.
Yeah, well, I think that's really a great example of how these things, like what we've happened the last year, can really lead to some kind of positive change, actually. But one of the things, actually, I think that's defining about you as a playwright is that you seem to completely bypass what we would think of as the Asian American theatre system. A lot of Asian American writers, they start in Asian American writing groups run by those theatres, and then maybe they get a production there, and then maybe they move to regional, to South Coast West, or something like that. But increasingly, a lot of you yourself, people like Julia Cho, kind of bypass that. So how then do you relate to the Asian American theatre scene, to the kind of minority theatre scene?
Yeah, I feel like I was really fortunate to get into so-called mainstream theater very early on. But I still feel that the Asian American theaters are incredibly important, and for a couple of reasons. First of all, there is my own history does intersect with an Asian American theater, which is East West Players, which is in Los Angeles. It's America's oldest East West Asian American theater, founded in 1965. And even though I said I didn't grow up seeing much theater or being part of theater, there was one exception to that, which is the fact that East West Players was founded by, among the founders was an actress named Beulah Kuo, who you might remember from Roman Polanski's movie Chinatown and something like that. Beulah was a friend of my father's, and my father was a CPA, who eventually, as you'll see in Yellowface, became a banker. But at the time he was a CPA, or what you used to call a PA, I believe. He was an accountant. And so he became the accountant for the bookkeeper for East West Players when they started. And my mother, who's a pianist, was the rehearsal pianist for a production they did of Minotti's operetta, The Medium, reset in post-war Japan. And I was about maybe 9 years old at the time. And it was either sort of hang out at rehearsals or, stay at my grandaunt's. So I hung out at rehearsals. And I don't really remember that much about them, honestly, but I think that it was maybe significant that I, at an early age, saw Asians in sort of leadership positions in the theater, and it didn't seem strange to me that would happen. So my personal history intersects with the Asian American theater movement, and B, I feel like that you can make an analogy to, let's take it out of the ethnic realm for a while and just talk about it aesthetically. You can make an analogy to avant-garde theaters.
Yeah.
Okay, avant-garde theaters are necessary not because all of the stuff that's produced in an avant-garde theater is going to reach the mainstream or influence the mainstream. They're necessary because there's a larger ecology of theater that needs to be maintained. And there needs to be places where you can do different kinds of work, some of which will end up influencing the mainstream, some of which won't, but will have its own value aesthetically. And I think that analogy applies to ethnic-specific theaters as well. That there is work that you can do in ethnic-specific theaters that you can't do in so-called mainstream theaters, and you need to maintain that balance and ecology.
Can I ask then, how do you kind of negotiate that yourself in your writing? Because I think a lot of academic work, a lot of critical work has said, okay, one of the reasons you're so successful is because you kind of create these plays that the mainstream can relate to. And there has been an argument that it's not necessarily exotica, but able, kind of almost what mainstream audiences might expect.
Yeah.
You know, they're kind of, there's Chinese opera in some collect pieces. You
Yeah.
know, there's those kind of identity questions and
Right.
those sorts of things, but you make it relatable.
Yeah, no, and you know, I mean, some people do say it's Orientalism, and it's, and I feel like I reached a point. I mean, is the question really about my aesthetic, or is it about how I relate to Asian American theaters? Or,
Well, do both.
Okay. I mean, you know, I sort of reached a point after my first, maybe 3 or 4 plays at the Public, where I sort of was wondering, you know, I had that same kind of self-critique. I was wondering, oh, am I just kind of creating Orientalia for the intelligentsia? You know, I'm sort of repackaging old Orientalist tropes in, you know, ways that are more acceptable to the New York Times. And you know, so I reacted to that by deciding, okay, I'm going to do a play that doesn't have any Asian characters, and I wrote this play called Rich Relations, which was basically another autobiographical play about my family, but then I just made them all white. So that reflected a certain authenticity also. And that didn't do so well. And then right after that, I kind of heard but you know, all these so-called failures are incredibly important for an artist. I mean, you have to fail. If you don't fail now and then, you're not working hard enough. And you know, that one had a lot of benefits for me, including the fact that I started to feel much more comfortable working with a wide variety of actors sort of ethnically. And then it's not, to me, entirely surprising that right after that I, you know, heard the story about the French diplomat who had a 20-year affair with a Chinese actress, blah, blah, that became M. Butterfly. So, you know, and then in terms of the Orientalist critique, I guess I feel like you know, M. Butterfly was therefore an attempt to critique the Orientalism. And, you know, and there are, of course, people who, you know, there's a lot of political opinions about M. Butterfly back and forth, and some people like it, some people hate it. And, you know, that's fine. That's what we do as artists. We put things out there, and people put it out there to be judged. But as to why it, you know, sort of relates to mainstream audiences, I don't know. You know, I have to say that Yellowface, for instance, was a play that I really thought was just going to be for an Asian American audience.
Yeah.
Because it's so, you know, it's very specific. It's about, you know, it's about a character based on me, you know, and it really came about because Tim Dang, who was the artistic director of East West Players, I hadn't written a new full-length play in about 7 or 8 years at that point, called me up and said, you know, well, are you going to write a new play? And he sort of gave me the kick in the butt that I needed. And I thought I was writing a little play for East West Players. And then it just became bigger. And then the Public was going to co-produce it, but then East West couldn't afford to do it. So then they ended up co-producing it with the Marquette Reform in LA. And so, you know, so they are kind of credited as, it was never done in their theater, which also happens to be called the David Henry Hwang Theater. But, so, I don't know. I mean, I feel like I'm trying to write things that I'm interested in, and when I'm lucky, other people agree, and it's obviously nice when a lot of people can relate to it, but I don't exactly know how to do that.
Yeah, I think one of the things is that you're kind of like the standard bearer, I think, for a lot of Asian American artists. They kind of look up to you, and I think that M. Butterfly in particular was one that when I've interviewed a lot of artists, they say, wow, you know, that was the play that made me think all things are possible. Because, you know, it went to Broadway and it was globally successful and so on. But how do you kind of feel about being the kind of the figurehead, as it were, in some senses?
Well, I think answering that question, yeah, you should see Yellowface.
Go see Yellowface.
But yeah, I mean, it's there are advantages and disadvantages to everything, right? So on the one hand, it's there's a lot of advantages to being, you know, I'm very lucky to have a successful career as a playwright and soon be able to make a living at it and all that. And then, yeah, there's a certain burden in having to be sometimes what I call the official Asian American. Because this is the way the media works. There's not really, when you have a group that hasn't been represented very much and then someone becomes prominent, that person is therefore expected to speak for the entire, you know, group of people. And of course that's not possible. You know, it's not, because any community is incredibly diverse. So at best, You can speak for a certain segment. I mean, you essentially can only speak for yourself. And then there are people who will relate to that, and then there are other people who will disagree with that and go, wow, that guy's a sellout because I don't agree with him. But, that's just the way it goes. And in the final analysis, only a community of artists can represent a community. And so I think the task is to try to create a community of artists. And therefore, that you express a wider range of views. And then audience members, part of the job, I think, of being an audience member is to figure out what works do I relate to. I don't like David's work, but I like Young Jean Lee's work or something. Once you make that association, you're actually identifying something very important about yourself. And I think that's kind of a wonderful way that theater interacts with the audience.
Yeah. But do you think there are specific barriers that minority writers face, and how would you suggest people navigate some of these things? Or is it just write what you want to write?
I mean, I think ultimately you have to just write what you want to write. But then there's a manipulative, a practical and potentially manipulative way that you then try to get the work on, and you try and get it produced, and you hopefully promote it and have it be well received. Those are two separate things. It's a creation of the work itself, which I think is a relatively pure thing, which is about writing what you believe in and going on a personal journey and finding out what you need to find out by creating this work. And then once you create it, then there's this whole kind of networking, who do you know, that has to do with how you then manage your career. And I think those are two slightly different, actually fairly different things.
Yeah. Do you feel you have a responsibility to write specifically Asian roles? I mean, you've done a huge diversity of work, not just in theatre, but film and so on. But do you feel like, write it for the Asian American actor?
Yeah, I don't. I mean, there have been times when I feel I've sort of taken up the banner of being the Asian American, the official Asian American, somewhat more fervently. And but basically, I think that my primary responsibility is to try to be the best artist that I can, because if I'm not actually creating good work, then it doesn't really matter what I'm doing otherwise, because no one's going to care. And that may take me to, writing work for Asian characters or not. But it is interesting to me at this point in my life, since I have done a number of things, and that when I go back to writing a play, which is my most personal form, I still seem to be kind of living in this world of issues and characters that is not dissimilar to the one that I started out with 30 years ago. But on the other hand, I guess I then go, well, that's not so strange for playwrights, really. I mean, most playwrights have a particular kind of a patch of soil that where they're now the analogy gets very strained, but where the plays grow, and nobody goes, oh, Tennessee Williams is the last universal writer for writing primarily about the American South, or Sam Shepard about the American West, or various Irish writers. I mean, it's not that unusual really to have an area that you continue to go back to.
I mean, you talked a lot about the kind of the failure, and you need some kinds of failures, but also when you have success, how do you manage that? Because I've interviewed writers who have had a phenomenally successful play, and then the pressure for the next play is, oh no, how do I write that? So have you learned to manage that over the years? Or how do you manage it?
I mean, I think that it is. Like I said, everything has advantages and disadvantages. So the success of M. Butterfly, of course, if I had to pick, I would want that. Right. But then there's the downside to it too, and it does have to do with the sort of that bubble of expectation, and failure really helps. And face value, which is which I write about to some extent in Yellowface. The failure face value was very useful that way, because it kind of burst that bubble, and then and at the moment at this I seem to having a very busy career period in my life, and a sort of mid-career surge or something. And I'm finding this moment pretty pleasant, except that I don't have as much time to write. So, you know, and I've been, like, the last 3 weeks I've been traveling, I think about 15 or 16 days of that. And, you know, it's great. And it's just a little harder to get work done.
Yeah, it's a lot harder. So you just have to kind of block off time when you go home.
Yeah.
Definitely just do that. Can you talk about how you turned, the influence of face value actually, and turning that into yellow face in a sense?
Okay, so for those of you who aren't familiar with yellowface, I think I probably should try to do a quick summary of the whole history of things, and I'll try to be brief. So most of you are aware that there was this controversy over the casting of Jonathan Pryce in the musical Miss Saigon.
We're going to have about that, I think, in the next year here.
Okay. Right. So that whole, the kind of intensity of that media struggle, really, in the early 90s was pretty unsettling to me, because it was just intense to be in the middle of a kind of culture wars event in the States. And, you know, it really only lasted about 2 weeks, but it was kind of a heavy 2 weeks. And one of the things I felt was that, wow, you know, the issue of casting and what it really means to play someone, and you play someone on stage, so it means to play a race in life, it's like a very interesting, complicated, nuanced issue. And there's no opportunity to get into that. And it sort of quickly devolved into this kind of media smackdown about who's going to win and who's going to lose. And the other thing is that everyone's so angry. You know, it's like minorities are angry because we're like, we've been denied all these opportunities for so many years, and like white people are angry because they're like, why should our artistic freedom be compromised by political correctness? And everyone just kind of ran to their respective corners and sort of put up their barriers, and there was not a lot of opportunity for sort of for discussion. So it kind of left me feeling like, well, how are we supposed to move forward as a society? And I wrote a play called Face Value, which was a comedy of mistaken racial identity, which I thought could explore the issue of what it means to play another race. And I wrote it as sort of a farce. I wrote it as my model was to do an Orton-esque farce. And, you know, they're really hard to do. And so